Hello, Blake Bruning here from Trinity Whip Company, and we're going over just some different whips I have for you to check out, just to compare and learn a little bit about them. Over here we got a 10-foot Paul Nolan Classic American, got a Joe Strand 12-foot Raiders, and then we have a Casey Tyler nylon 6-foot Bullwhip. Over here we got a Steve Townsend 8-foot Bullwhip, and we got this is one of mine. It's a used one as well. All these are used except for the Steve Townsend right now. This is an 8-foot Trinity Whip Company Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls model, and so an Indiana Jones style again. And this is a Peter Thorndike's first Bullwhip made. Now, generally one thing to look at, I guess we'll just talk about a few things, but mainly taper. You know, generally all these whips, it tends to be our style, our preferences. Everything, first of all, should taper, and it's the Paul Nolan we're looking at. But generally Paul and all the others are very similar, we'll point it out. But everything should have a taper. No matter what, it should always taper. The question is how much to taper, or how fast to taper is where it slows down, however. Now, there's a lot of ways to do it. I'm not really just saying this is the only way to do it, but all of us kind of tend to do similar things. Like on this Paul Nolan, like I said, it tapers pretty fast around the quarter mark, anywhere around this area. So it kind of tapers a little faster here, and then the rest slows down. And it's very common with this Joe too. As you can see on the Joe Strain, it tapers pretty fast, which is about the quarter mark or so. And then now it slows down the rest of the way. This 6-foot's kind of hard to see, but it's the same thing. It tapers pretty fast, and then it slows down for the rest. So does the Steve Townsend. Kind of tapers fast to about the quarter and slows down. So does this Trinity Whip Company. So you can see it taper pretty fast to about the quarter mark. And then it slows down. And so does the Peter Thorndike. Depending on how you cut out your core, some people just make a tapered triangle piece when they're talking about leather. And you know, as long as you can just cut it all the way to the point you want. But the thing is, it stretches sometimes as well. So to just cut one out and don't stretch it beforehand and then taper it by hand can be a problem. This is where tapering by hand as a whip maker comes in really handy, because I will make my core a little fat. Normally that's what I do, and I stretch it to see what I got, and then I hand taper it to get the desired shape. And you know, I can taper that faster or slower as needed. Different whips call for different things and different things you're going for, but generally, like I said, a lot of these professionals tend to want to taper a little fast, and then they slow it up as the rest of the way goes down. And just whether it helps on the weight or the economy of flow, you know, different things like that. But generally every whip maker, whether you're a novice or not, you guys have a taper. Finding out the way you like to taper is good. But it would be bad if it's a lot fatter in here. Let's just say you had a slow taper, like a really slow taper, and then around the halfway point it went a little fast. That would really cause the end of it to kind of whip out in more of a whiff, as opposed to a nice smooth roll out and crack. You know, you want things proportionate. But looking at these different whips, the thing I would like to point out on the Joe, just so you can see it, is all these were pretty much, except maybe the nylon, you know, a little different, were made similar to the two-belly method, as opposed to, by two-belly method, I mean a belly with a yoke, and then the bellies, not just bellies braided on everything. And what this usually causes, as you can tell when you look at your whip and the handle, you'll see Joe's flares out right there. This is where, if you look at it, right before that knot is where it flares out. And that's the transition of, you know, the whip itself, like the handle ends around here, and you know, this is the transition from, you know, handle to thong, but this is the transition from diamond to herringbone. And you start wherever you start your belly braid is where the flare begins. And you can tell that a lot of times you'll see these whips that have no flare whatsoever. Now, unless you're making a target whip, and that's part of your design, when someone makes Indiana Jones whip, if you're really trying to hit an Indiana Jones look, you definitely need to use a yoke for that reason, so it can flare out the way it's supposed to. Now, all these whips have a lot of great things in common. I don't know which one to pick out first, but I'll just tell you what. We'll look at the Paul Nolan. Now, like I said, this is used, and I talked in our earlier video about how it's used, depending on how it's quill, may be the way it lays. But as you can see with this Bullwhip, it still pretty much holds all its shape. And if we look around his Bullwhip, as you should see, expected from someone like Paul Nolan, there are, you know, no gaps on the braiding, and there are no kinks or any spot where, like, it would, I don't even want to bend this to show you, but it would just hang like that on its own really badly. You know, that only kinked up because I pushed it. But same thing with all these. You can see just sitting out where there would or would not be a kink. on this Steve Townsend, again, there's just a little handle flare, and it's up around here, but there's a little handle flare again. And then as you go around, like I said, you can see the seam. They're just the way he coiled it initially, of course, keeps this, but there's a seam is maintained throughout the whole curve. There's only a couple issues, minor issues that you can see with this, but overall the braiding on the Townsend is, you know, really good. It's got some bevel in there. There's a couple issues you might catch right there, but not really going into detail too much. I kind of wanted to talk about drops today, but the same thing. Let's just look at some of these braids. This is the Trinity Whip Company one, you know. And like I said, there's no part where it just hangs at a funky angle, you know. Same thing with the Joe Strand. You can look at this handle braid. So there's no gaps, and even though this is a well-used whip, you know, it still kind of holds the original shape, but that's due more to the person who cracked it and stored it well. Like I said, all these are used except the Townsend right here. Same thing with the Peter Thorndike. Like I said, you can see no gaps in the braiding. All right, and it still retains the curve, and so does this Casey Tyler. I wish I had one of his leather. What I love best about Casey's work when it came to nylon is his handles. This is supposed to be like an Indiana Jones style as far as diameter, is immaculate. It feels like I'm holding one of those mini soda cans. It's just so perfectly cylindrical, you know. And I love this. A lot of times when people make these nylon transition knots, they've got to be so long because you can't adjust your strands, but they're not fat. A lot of times these are way too fat, I feel. And it's just more of an aesthetic thing, though. Now, Casey also uses a leather fall, which I like. That kind of really helps add to the overall flow and taper of a whip. Not that you can't use a nylon one. But with this, I don't know which one I'll pull out, but I'd like to almost pull one out that might have a drop that got pulled through much. Not that it matters too much. But let's see. We'll just talk about plat count. So when you're trying to figure out what a plat count is, let's see the best way to do it. All right, there we go. So with this, as you can see, you've got the herringbone of these chevrons. Well, if you were to look at a strand, all right, whoops, make sure you can see it. If you look at a strand, and then you can see from here to here that there'll be 1, 2, 3 strands that it overlaps, all right? That would mean it's a 12 plat because there's 3 here and then there's 3 there. You know, that's the way it works because you got 2 sides on it. So this is a 12 plat because you see 1, 2, 3. There's 3 strands that run under this chevron. And if it was a 16, you'd be able to see that there were 4. If there was a, 24, you'd be able to see there were 12, 6, things like that. So, this is how you can tell the plat. And then every whip drops. And I know a lot of people said it. I think Joe said it to me first. Not that they haven't all said it to me. Paul, probably Casey as well, But the goal is everything you have to drop is strand, and you can't hide a strand drop. Your goal is just to make them as clean as possible. And I think we're about to come on to this first strand drop. Now, right here you can see the first strand drop on this, and this is an older Joe, but some people would say that got pulled in a little too much, and it's not really a big deal if that happens. It's not pulled so much there's a gap. And when people talk about gaps in whips, a strand getting pulled through a little bit to where you might see a little crease, and I think I might be able to pull that off on one of these, and it happens. Let's see if we can find it on this. All right, like on this Townsend, you can kind of see it right there. Right there, so minimal. It just got, when it got pulled through and then braided over, when he went down and pulled it, he might have just pulled a little too tight, or more or less he might have pulled a little soon, so a little down here, so when it pulled in, it didn't just snug up. It just got pulled a little much too. Now, that really isn't what you would call a gap in the braiding. There is a gap, and it's in the drop, which is part of the braiding, but once again, you really wouldn't call that a gap in the braiding. A gap in the braiding would be, while this is braided, there's a gap in it. So on strand drops, it's occasion that, whip makers may pull it through a little too much where it comes in. Like even this Joe, I've seen Joe make perfect strand drops, unbelievable work. I've seen all these guys make perfect strand drops. But, every now and again it gets pulled a little through too much, and it might show a little bit, or Joe's pulled through a little more, so it wasn't a perfect V, but still there was no gap there. Again, none of this affects how the whip throws. If there were gaps all over the whip, like actual gaps in the braiding, overall, it won't affect the flow of a whip too much, But when you're buying a high quality whip, these are things that should be eliminated. Like I said, there's always a grace period. And with all these whips, you know, Peter, just that we'll go back in time a little bit. I've had influences from all these guys, and so I just thought I'd mention these real quick. Townsend, like I said on my earlier video, he's the one that he was new when he started, pretty new, and I got to shadow him to learn the basics, how to prep, cut, stretch, braid. I've always had a relationship with Joe. I bought tons of his whips through the years, and he helped talk me through a lot. And I eventually got to visit Joe to help me on making a match set of stock whips. Spent a weekend at his house. And Joe, I do try to hit a lot of his guidelines as how he makes his construction. You know, I think a lot of them kind of do. They all do their own thing. Paul Nolan, he's always been very helpful to me and giving little points of advice here and there. He's always been helpful, you know, looking at my work and making some small suggestions. You know, he's a really great guy. All these guys are really great guys. Peter, he helped me make my first stock whip and was always helpful with that. And so when I had him make his first Bullwhip, you know, for me, you know, I kind of shared my process with him too. But Peter is, you know, is really generous of him to always be that open with me, and I've always appreciated our relationship, just like all these other guys. And Casey, this is one of the first nylons I had him made when I first made his acquaintance like 5 or 6 years ago. Casey makes some really good rue. I really wish I had one of his rue, but Casey helped me a lot in the beginning as too. All these guys I've kind of have a pretty well relationship with to one degree or another. Casey helped me after I worked with Steve. You know, I'd always got everything good from Joe. You know, I'd definitely say Joe has been my mentor and what I aspired to. And Casey helped me see things a lot early off and helped me with a lot of suggestions here and there. He's always been very helpful. And but like I said, all these guys, all of us make whips, bull whips anyways, very, very similar. Now, a lot of these are kind of indie style motifs, and the classic American's kind of similar. And so is this one. Peter's is not really an indie style, but like I said, all these bull whips do have certain things in common. And I guess, like I said, I'm really kind of talking about the taper. I'm not really trying to point out, you know, not having gaps as much or everything else I said. But like I said, you can tell with the braiding, there, you know, when you're buying a high quality whip, things like gaps shouldn't really happen. Now, there is a grace period with all whip makers, and I just want to point out the Steve Townsend real quick. I think, you know, Steve only gets to make whips on the weekends on occasion. He, you know, just because he's a very busy man with his other job and, you know, wife and 3 kids. So he's more what you would call a hobbyist or enthusiast or part-time. But I just got to say, I forget what number he's on. I know he's coming near 50. It's not a lot of whips, but as you can see, by his craftsmanship, it's not how many whips you make. It really comes down to the quality you make. So it doesn't matter if you've made 200 whips. You know, if you've made 200 whips, you could make them all fast and loose or bad, or you know, the perfectionist side really kicks in. It's really nice to realize that just because there is a grace period, you know, you don't have to have a lot of these issues deep in your whips. You know, some people have a harder time learning or don't have the right sources, or they're just not a much perfectionist. But, you know, after about, you know, 20, 30 whips, most of your issues should be very slim. And even if they are still some of the main points of light you got to work on, you know, by 50 whips, you should be pretty good at what you're doing. And as you're still growing, of course, in this whole process, and, you know, after about 100, you just feel more comfortable with the process. There really shouldn't be major issues like severe gapping, really bad drops, parts where the taper suddenly drops down faster than it should in the plaiting, and other things. And like I said, I'm going to pull out some more whips in some of these videos, but I just wanted to kind of talk more about the taper, and we can talk more about the actual braiding or braiding technique and other stuff later. But just wanted to showcase some of these whips to show you 6 different whip makers, and kind of give you an idea for what a general bullwhip taper is looking for, how it does taper a little fast and then slow down. All these have more qualities that I'd love to go in detail, but, you know, that's probably good enough for this one video. Again, my name is Blake Bruning from Trinity Whip Company, and this is a series that I'm going to call the Whip Maker's Eye, I believe, something to that effect, or how to gain the Whip Maker's Eye. But whether you are a whip maker or a novice whip maker, which I'm kind of gearing these towards, or especially just a whip cracker, it's good to kind of start to understand how to look at things in a whip. As I stated previously, I had 100 whips go through my hands in my first several years of cracking whips, and I never once really looked at a whip or knew what I was looking at. Like I said, I could notice if there's an obvious gap, or if the braiding spiraled, which, you know, the braiding shouldn't really spiral. I know when it's used and, like I said, it curls up and somebody doesn't curl it right, it may, you know, the seam may be off a little, but the braiding should never really spiral around. Even if you did store it poorly, the braiding should be nice and tight, and shouldn't just start the seam spiral around. And we'll talk more about seam and other things later, but God bless. Thanks for watching, and I hope this gives just a little bit more insight. Thank you.